Today, we are physically dispersed. We gather virtually. So, I would like us to take a moment together to reflect the meaning of place. In doing so, we recognise the various traditional lands from which we join together today. We acknowledge the elders, past and present, of all the land on which we work and live, and listen to their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. We acknowledge these unceded lands and the ongoing connection to lands, sea and community. For this is and always will be Aboriginal land. Please now take a moment to join me in acknowledging the traditional lands that you are on and respectfully honour the custodians who continue to care for country.
He honore, he karoria, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Huri no mai tēnei pito, ki tēnā pito, ki tērā pito, ki ngā tāngata whenua o te ao. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great honour on behalf of Māori here in Aotearoa to acknowledge us all and the sovereign unceded lands we stand on, the waters, mountains and forests that sustain us, the ancestors whose dreams have inspired us, and the future generation for whose rights we fight. How wonderful it is to be gathered together for another Lime Connection, albeit electronically, in this really extraordinary time in world history that we find ourselves in. May our connection be fun and fabulous, authentic and creative, powerful and provocative, healing and radical. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Hey, welcome to everybody. My name's Candice Mckenzie and I'm a Warramungu Warlpiri woman, born and raised on Larrakia country and now living down on Wadawurrung country. I'm your facilitator for today's discussion. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge also that as we gather for this meeting physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to all Indigenous people in the room with us today. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. Just a reminder that the session will be recorded and available for your viewing later, that we expect that the conversations, questions and comments will always be respectful. Just a reminder that the Dennis McDermott Memorial Award for Excellence in Cultural Safety, the application can be accessed from LimeConnect. That there will be an open Zoom session after the session to network, chat and reflect on today's session. And also just a reminder that these conversations might not necessarily be monitored, and please to continue to maintain a respectful and professional dialogue. We ask that you share on your social media with the Lime Staying Connected hashtag, and that you please don't share links and passwords, and rather that you encourage friends and colleagues to register through the Lime Connection website. Just a reminder to contact the Lime team via email if you're having any difficulties. They'll be watching and we'll try and help if there's any difficulties. And that we'll be accepting questions throughout the keynote, throughout the panel session, and to please post in the Q&A function and be aware that others can see what you write. So welcome to the Indigenous Health Education panel. It is my honour and my privilege to introduce my esteemed colleagues and our esteemed panel to each of you. Dr. Andrea McKivett, a researcher at Adelaide Rural Clinical School at the University of Adelaide. Andrea is an Aboriginal woman from the Kimberley in northwestern Australia and currently works as a medical education academic in South Australia. Dr. Brett Biles, the Director of Indigenous Health Education for the Office of Medical Education, Faculty of Medicine and Health at UNSW. He holds a Bachelor of Physiotherapy and a Master's in Indigenous Health and a PhD. And Dr. Jade Tamatea. So Jade works both clinically as an endocrinologist at the District Health Board and as a senior lecturer within the University of Auckland. Jade's appointment gives her an avenue to continue her research while also helping to develop the next generation of Māori clinicians, and she's the coordinator of the Māori Health Curriculum for the clinical years. Welcome to my panel. This is just a quick opportunity that if I've missed any really vital information as part of your introductions, but I'm sure the audience would like to hear from each of you as well. So just an opportunity to quickly go around the room. I might start in the same order. And Andrea, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself just briefly.
Yes, thank you, Candice. Thank you for the opportunity to get to speak on the panel with colleagues today. So I'm Andrea, I'm Gidja from the Kimberley. I'm currently in Port Augusta on Bangala and Nukunu country. I'm currently doing a PhD in communication skills in medical ed. Thanks for having me on today.
Thanks, Candice. Yeah, Brett Biles here, a Murawari fella, living and working on Wiradjuri country in Albury Wodonga. Also work on Bidjigal country up in Sydney as well. But due to the COVID crisis, get to live and work on my country that I've actually been on for nearly close to 20 years now. So yeah, looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Jade?
Tēnā rā koutou, he uri ahau no Ngāti Manupoto, no Ngāti Kahungunu hoki. I come to express my links to two iwi, one here in the middle of the North Island, Ngāti Manupoto, but also over into the East Coast, Ngāti Kahungunu. Really excited to be here also and to share in our lived experience on educating with Indigenous knowledge. Kia ora.
Beautiful, thanks Jade. So just again, another reminder that if you have any questions, I'm going to do my best to monitor the chat box. But otherwise, I believe my Lyme colleagues will also point out. But in the interim, if my panel is happy, I might get started and ask the first question just to kick things off. Does that sound okay? Wonderful. So a question for each of you, and just to keep things simple, we might go in the same order. So start with Andrea and finish with Jade. My question is how do you best navigate the health disparities in health education and culture? So culture as an organisation. And what are the implications for embedding this in Indigenous health education?
Candice?
Thanks. Andrea?
Yeah, thinking about health disparities and looking at thinking about what the drivers of health disparities are, and looking back around being able to provide a lens of colonisation and the impact that colonial legacies have on the ability to access effective healthcare and the worldviews and the values that come around how health is defined, as well as how healthcare is delivered. And I think that plays a part in our institutions as well, when we're thinking about our medical culture and our institutional culture, how we are looking to address the negative effects of colonisation and make education and healthcare delivery more accessible and safer in terms of some of those other drivers of institutionalised racism, of the effects of having worldviews and values marginalised within education and within healthcare delivery. So I think those fundamental things guide our education and how medical practitioners deliver healthcare as one-on-one, but also within hospitals and systems. But as you said, it's about a culture of an institution and how we as educators look at what colonisation and racism looks like within an education program.
Beautiful. Thanks, Andrea. Brett?
Yeah, I think with that sort of that question, Candice, it's quite a large, complex question as well. And I think sort of generally speaking, I've been in the health industry now for like nearly 15 years, but within the medicine, I suppose, perspective for about 2.5 years. And we sort of I see that from a health perspective, it becomes quite piecemeal at times. And we look at that biomedical approach to health, where it's a bit of a piecemeal approach. And I suppose from our perspective with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we look at health more holistically as well. And I don't see at times that we have our systems and structures in place that really, I suppose, you actually look at promoting that holistic approach to healthcare as well. And I suppose what we're trying to look at doing within our curriculum is looking at that health through that lens of a holistic approach. But then I suppose, what systems and structures are in place within our mainstream services, I suppose, that can encourage that holistic approach, or I suppose, provide strength and links to that holistic approach as well, which I think is fundamentally important. And I think Andrea mentioned a really important word there around racism or anti-racist training as well. And I think, we're all good at, I suppose, speaking about cultural awareness training, which is that sort of foundational, fundamental knowledge. But I suppose at times it's that struggle of then scaffolding into that higher order thinking as well. And from an education perspective, I suppose that's where I see where we need to be going. Is anti-racist training is obviously fundamental, but scaffolding away from that basic cultural awareness training of this is the 101 of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures look like, but then saying what are the problems with our systems and structures that are stopping us as Aboriginal people accessing, for example, mainstream health services at the rates that we should be accessing as well. So I think we have a lot of work to obviously go in, obviously progressing this and moving forward. But I think first and foremost, it's our worldviews. How do we see the world? Our biases and attitudes and our beliefs, are they impacting in good ways or bad ways for Aboriginal people to access our mainstream services as well? So there's definitely some big implications there, but I think we sort of need to scaffold away from cultural awareness training and more into that higher order thinking around cultural safety, cultural competence, but calling it for what it is around these racist practices that we obviously are obviously being involved with every day.
Thanks, Brett. And I guess I'm interested in what you mean specifically, and in particular for perhaps our non-teaching audience, about what is scaffolding and what does that look like as somebody that's worked perhaps more so than maybe some of our other panellists across disciplines. How do you scaffold that? And does that look the same across all of the programs, regardless of whether you're in medicine or perhaps physiotherapy as you have been in the past?
I think I think scaffolding can obviously be quite similar, but obviously become discipline specific as well. So, for example, our expectations of our first year students in medicine at UNSW is that they obviously need to know the importance of our histories, cultures, and contemporary realities at that sort of baseline, basic level, if you'd like, if that's a word. But then when we're progressing through into sort of second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth year, that we are scaffolding, and that higher order thinking is more specific and becomes discipline specific, where students have the foundational knowledge, and now how is that then applied to, for example, psychology or psychiatry? How is it then applied to, for example, a specific aspect around GP training, or how is it then applied for, I suppose, surgeons or specialist colleges as well? So it's about becoming more discipline specific in that particular aspect, but starting off in that fundamental foundational knowledge. And it's quite similar within physiotherapy, where you start off with foundational knowledge and you become more discipline specific, and our expectations around assessment and education become more higher order thinking, where I suppose what we expect our students to know at year one is going to be so much higher in years 3 and years 4. And I suppose then so the implications is, how do we then assess that? But also, how do we ensure that it's integrated throughout the whole curriculum and not this piecemeal approach as well?
Beautiful. Thanks, Brett. I'll come back to an extra question that I've had, but I'll allow Jade the opportunity. Jade, do you need me to repeat the question for you? Or are you happy to go? Wonderful.
Yeah, no, I'm awesome. So thinking about navigation, I think it's really important to, how do we navigate this space? It's really important to remember that, we have histories of being navigators, of being able to find our way and to know where we need to get to. And so I think, lying on that autonomy to be able to define what that curriculum looks like, and knowing ourselves where we want to be. I think by mapping that, we get to have a little bit more structure over it, understanding where are we going, what do we see as our vision, we talk about the kaupapa, what is the topic or the purpose for us embedding this language, this curriculum. And realistically, it's about the fact that we want to influence the system to be better and more responsive at looking after our people. And we want to raise a next generation of healthcare professionals who have the skill base to do that in a responsive and appropriate way. And then you start to work out, once you've worked out that, you get to navigate a little bit about how we're going to get there. And I don't want the first question to go past without all three of us calling out racism, because that's critical. But I think, moving that, and part of the journey, moving our critical consciousness to being really mindful of the racism in the system, in the structures, in the environments that we are both working in and teaching in. So I think that is really, we need to be brave enough to navigate through that. But equally, like our ancestors navigated, we also have the ability to read the environment. And so we have the ability to respond, react, adjust, and keep growing towards this goal that we all have. We have a real strength of collective thinking, which I think gives us a real benefit in this space. And so being able to lean on each other as Indigenous educators across the nations, we really get to grow together and know what it is that we need to be doing, for our people.
I'm interested, I guess, Jade, in what you mean by autonomy. Well, I understand what you mean by autonomy, but how do we actually achieve autonomy in being able to deliver this when we've got this very much this Western construct that we are working within? So how do we find space? How do we allow time to be able to teach Indigenous health? How do we negotiate that with what is, more often than not, there are so few of us, and we are operating within this realm of something that's existed for so long. So our non-Indigenous colleagues will often tell us, and I personally find it really, really tricky sometimes. So how do we actually get that autonomy, and how do we get our non-Indigenous colleagues to support that, to see that it's important to teach Indigenous health?
Well, I think expressing that has to be the critical aspect. And so getting our colleagues and our institutions to understand that we need to self-determine what the ultimate outcomes are, what the critical competencies are, what that journey and pathway looks like. And we need allies to support us to be able to deliver that, but that the self-determination of that is the part that we can't let go of, that we need to have control over that we need to be the drivers of that. And I say very collectively we there, so that's us with the people in community, but it's a tension, I agree with you, but it's probably, if I had to pick one part to fight on, that's the part, because we can work with embedding it into the entire curriculum is critical, and that is where we require the allies and partnering to get it across the curriculum, but determining what the direction is and which star we're heading towards, that's ours to determine.
So this question is for no one in particular. I'm happy for any of our panellists to comment here, but we often say to our non-Indigenous colleagues, we need you to be an ally. We need you to sit in the room with us. What are some specific tips and strategies for what that looks like for non-Indigenous people in this space, and to be able to better support us? Like I said, they can be in the room, they can be present, and they go, oh yes, we should allow time for this, but is there anything else that they could be doing?
I'm happy to try and answer that, Candice. I think it's pretty easy and it's pretty straightforward, where our allies need to listen to us. We have the answers and the solutions we have for thousands and thousands of years. And yes, since colonisation and invasion, our health and well-being disparities have obviously gone through the roof. But I think, an ally is really important, because there's so few of us within this space, and we can't do it all within that particular aspect. But it's pretty simple, like create the space and create the time to actually listen to us, what we have to say. And obviously how Jade was saying around that self-determination is really important. But bearing in mind that each community from our perspective is obviously diverse and very different as well. So it's about having those localized conversations and those localized solutions as well. And just because you're working up in Sydney, it's obviously going to be a little bit different down this way where I am, 6 hours from Sydney as well. So it's about just creating that space and creating that time to actually, really wanting to actually listen to I suppose our answers and our solutions to some of these problems. And it sounds quite easy, but we do work within these constraints in higher education where we have a lot of outcomes and expectations that we have to meet, and it mightn't be in this particular avenue or this particular platform where by taking that time to become an ally, it mightn't meet your research output or your educational output, but at the same time, that conversation dialogue is so fundamentally important by creating that time and just listening to obviously what we have to say as a starting point.
Thanks, Brett. That's really helpful. Ladies, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just going on what Brett and Jade have said around being able to create space and being able to recognise what your power might be as an ally and what your role is, being able to form relationships to know where you can assist and where you can advocate for to create the desired outcome. So that might be around advocacy for time in the curriculum to let Indigenous colleagues be able to then determine, as Jay said, what that curriculum content is, or being able to make decisions around resource allocation or enhanced staff support and safe environment. So it's a bit of a reflection on what you bring to the institution, where your power lies, and then being able to build relationships with Indigenous academics to see how you can best use that to advocate and empower your colleagues.
That's a wonderful answer. Thanks, Andrea. Jade, do you have any final comments on that particular topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Aotearoa, we've had a relatively public kind of debate come out in this space after a group of professors and emeritus professors of my organisation wrote a letter to one of our local magazines calling for, in horror that Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge base was going to be integrated into the secondary school science curriculum, and that the impact science has had on the colonisation of Indigenous people was also to be taught as part of the curriculum. And the pushback from these Pākehā colleagues was that Mātauranga Māori wasn't a science. And I think that this gives sort of an example of the spectrum of ways in which non-Indigenous academics can interact into the space. So kind of building on what's already been said, making sure that one can acknowledge their own privilege and power is really important, and was something that was missed by this group. Being able to be an active learner in the space, acknowledge what you know, and more importantly, acknowledge what you don't know. So as the debate grew, it became very evident in some of the interviews that these academics had no knowledge of what Mātauranga Māori was, hadn't put in an effort to find out what Mātauranga Māori was, but also felt that they were in such a privileged space that they could comment on it. So I think as like a bare minimum, our non-Indigenous colleagues have to learn when they have to get out of the way and stop being part of the ongoing colonising process that the institutions can have, that education can have. But equally, on a more positive side, there was a really big, in the debate, a really big swing back, and we saw a whole group of non-Indigenous allies stand up and call out that behaviour and disagree, and a open letter of over 2,000 people, predominantly non-Indigenous, wrote back calling out that that was not an appropriate way, and acknowledging the harm that that kind of narrative and that kind of power has on our Indigenous trainee academic staff and students.
Yeah. And how does that make for you guys as individuals, as you guys as academics in the space, what does that actually do for your job? How much more challenging then does it become? Do you find then that you've had to go back and start from the start with having to, I certainly find that when something quite topical comes up, if I could use the example, say, of the Collingwood Football Club over here in Australia with some the issues around racism, it has challenges, and I find that I have to go back to the start more often than not. So how do we address that? What are the challenges that you find in particular, and what would be your advice, again, for some of our non-Indigenous colleagues in, Andrea, as you called it, being able to better advocate in this space. And that's for nobody in particular, but if anybody's got any
Well, I just want to jump in because we've been in this space just recently and just say, I think we all need to acknowledge the waste of our time and space that goes into having to fight what are ridiculous arguments that we shouldn't be having in this day and age. And that, you know, we talk about cultural loading, but that's a degree of cultural load that our colleagues don't have to do every day and sit down and formulate what their academic response to this kind of garbage is. And so until the institution acknowledges that amount of work that we're doing on top of the day job, there's some real harm, additional harm that goes on with this.
Perfect.
And I think part of it too, Candice, is around, you know, we as Aboriginal peoples, you know, we navigate that mainstream service, whether it's educational or from a health perspective. So we're always uncomfortable, and that's just part of who we are. But it's about making our allies and our non-Aboriginal colleagues uncomfortable as well, because if we, yeah, that sense of having a conversation, which is really difficult, is such an important way of transforming, I suppose, the actual way we see the world as well. And I know Andrea and Jade were speaking about people's worldviews and obviously identifying our privileges as well. But, you know, the amount of times with colleagues, both inside education but outside of education, saying, I can't believe I don't know that, or I didn't understand that, or I don't want to ask that question because I'm fear I'm going to upset or offend somebody. I think that's a bit of a Groundhog Day conversation that we're forever having. I am anyway, around, well, you know, if you say something wrong, we'll tell you. You know, we're not that soft in regards to, hey, like, ask a question. If it's uncomfortable, we'll let you know. But you've got to be uncomfortable as a way of learning, you know, from an ally's perspective as well. And if you don't know something, that's okay. But take the time with yourself. We don't have to be here to train you every single day. That's not our role. Yeah, 24/7, which I think is an important aspect. And we're having a conversation before we started with Tex Walker from Adelaide Football Club. Like, you know, we don't need to be the advocates around, you know, providing you that moral compass of, it's okay, we're here to support you through your cultural awareness training or whatever it is. You need to take the lead and be, you know, actually be proactive in seeking out some of these answers to your questions as well, is really important.
Yeah, beautiful. I appreciate that. Andrea, any final comments from you?
Oh, no, I agree with what Brett and Jade have commented on, and just from experience, when you're in a position where you have really good high-level leadership and support, some of that extra work, you notice suddenly things to advocate for assessment or time in the curriculum suddenly don't become a daily struggle. It just happens. And so you can divert your attention to actually planning the content as opposed to trying to get that 20%. So yeah, it is about how that high level leadership and understanding from the non-Indigenous colleagues can lessen your workload so you can get some of the work you need to get done much more effectively.
Beautiful, thank you. So I have one final question before we throw out to anybody potentially in the audience that might have any questions. Given the challenges that we often face in Indigenous health education, or just, I think, Indigenous education broadly, what keeps you here? What keeps you going? What makes you stay? And that's for anybody to kickstart. Otherwise, I'm happy to pick on people also. And let's go, Brett.
That's a really good question. I think I ask myself this every day, to be honest, especially when things get a little bit tough. But I think, you know, first and foremost is that, you know, trying to make that change from the inside out, I think is really important, where, yes, yeah, we only have these students, and I say from a medical perspective, for a short period of time within their careers as well. So if we can look at, you know, creating that small bit of change from the get-go when we have them before they go out into their final year placements as such, I think it's important that we can look at creating that change. And I always say to my students that, I get the comment from my students saying, oh, but, we're only one person part of this bigger system. I say, well, change your thinking. You are the system. The system that you work in, that's you. It's nobody else. You are part of that system as well. So if we can look at trying to change that system from the inside out, i.e. from an education perspective as a starting point, that's a really important part of it. And I always think about the struggles that our forefathers and foremothers went before us as well around getting these rights. For us to obviously be an active participant within the world we live in is really important. But I think also, that next step is for our generations to obviously come as well, where they don't need to be going through what we've gone through growing up, and obviously what we're continually going through, where in 10 years' time, where what we're trying to embed now becomes normalised and becomes part of the knowledges that we're thinking about. So I think that responsibility is an important aspect from my perspective personally, but also that way of giving back to my community is such an important aspect as well.
Thanks, Brett. Andrea?
Yeah, very similar to Brett. I feel very privileged to be able to work in medical ed and to be able to contribute to education around thinking about how we can create differences in practice. So on that one-to-one, how someone might engage in clinical decision-making and provide a more acceptable and appropriate service, but then that does lead to institutional change, which is what we are working for, so that when our community members are accessing healthcare or within the community, that there is less negative effects, less perpetuation of those negative health disparities and stereotypes, less racism in the healthcare system. That's what we're working towards, but also being a small part of being able to make healthcare education more accessible for the young ones coming through. I feel very lucky that I was able to access a pre-medicine program and have the opportunity to study. So being able to shape some of the curriculum so that Indigenous students coming through feel more safe in their identity and able to succeed is something else that I play a very small part in, but is why I really enjoy this work as well.
Perfect. And Jade?
Yeah, just to total what's already been said, I think our position or our privilege for being in this space is to be an agent of change, to be part of the solution. And that's a really powerful space to be in. In particular, when you get up on the hard days, just remembering what the kaupapa is, remembering the why, which is always around, will this work directly benefit our people and their health and well-being? And if I can answer yes to that, then it's actually a really awesome space to be in. For me also, on the tough times, I really like to lean on our whānau, our family in this collective space of Indigenous health education. And I quite enjoy our really safe echo chamber that we live in sometimes, which allows us to take the critical thinking to another level and allows us to really have a great opportunity to envisage what the future might look like in Indigenous health. I think that's really, that helps to keep me driven as well, rather than just the drudgery sometimes of having to fight the system. But last and probably most important is that the future actually is starting to look bright. I get actually really inspired at times where this next generation of medical students and young doctors are the well-educated, knowledgeable, critical thinkers around ethnicity and the drivers of health and equity. And that's just so inspiring to think that is the system changing as the next generation come through. And intertwined in there is this amazing space of Indigenous excellence coming through in the next generation too, who are going to, take this to whole nother levels. So yeah, find that really inspiring.
Jade, had you asked me 7 years ago when I started in medical education, some days it was too scary. I didn't want to admit to some of the things that I was seeing and experiencing, but I could not agree with you more on the last point, in that seeing the trajectory of the students as they come through 7 years later, and the changes that are starting to be created. And I suspect Andrea and Brett, you are in each of your schools. It's a little bit inspiring. In fact, it's more than a little bit inspiring, and it truly does give me at least a great deal of hope moving forward, and certainly is probably one of the biggest reasons that I stay. A lot of people ask me that same question, so I was intrigued by each of your responses also, but seeing the change in behaviour, in attitudes, in belief, it's been really inspiring to say the least. But that's it for my broader, let me ask you all the same questions and see what the differences are. But before I go in now to ask you specifically some questions, I wanted to give an opportunity to the audience. I also wanted to give you an opportunity to quickly catch your breath and take a sip of water if you so need. So the first thing I want to do is just to quickly plug Lime and remind everybody in the audience that we really encourage you to be sharing on your various social media platforms. And remember the hashtag, I should know this off the top of my head, Lime Staying Connected, and to continue to pop any questions that you might have in the Q&A box, and we will field those as they come through. But in the interim, Lilon, I believe you might have one or two questions you'd like to ask of the panel before we move on.
Thanks, Candice. I always have questions. And it's part of the joy of actually engaging in this, because it's always interesting and always stimulating, and I'm old and been in this for a while. I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Brett, actually, was you mentioned systems and structures that that are there and really are a challenge on a daily basis in healthcare service delivery and looking at racism. I'm just wondering if there are also systems and structures that can help and actually strengthen a holistic approach, or are there only barriers and challenges?
No, I think there's definitely enablers there as well, Leland, about sort of, and I think, yeah, it depends on sort of where you're at. Yeah, I suppose, for example, down here in Albury-Wodonga, we have different, I suppose, challenges and enablers and barriers, yeah, is really important to be thinking about. But I think, you know, first and foremost, obviously, sort of identifying some of those limitations as a starting point, and then sort of really, you know, critically reflecting on, you know, what some of these issues are. And I go back to my PhD, which I finished last year, where we've got this Aboriginal health service here in Albury-Wodonga, and the key aspect was that Aboriginal men weren't accessing the service. So instead of saying to the men, "You're the problem," what's the health service doing wrong? Why aren't you accessing the health service, and what can the health service do to improve? You know, making this space a safer space for you as Aboriginal men. So it's actually, you know, I suppose, taking away from that you as a patient is a problem, but we as a health service are the problem. What can we do from a critical reflection perspective of saying, hey, this is what the men have identified as some concerns from the health service or health systems perspective. What can then we look at obviously doing to look at improving our interaction, which will then obviously improve our engagement as well. So taking it away from you're the problem as a patient, but we as a health service and the health system are the problem. What can we do to actually change that problem as well? And that comes back to really, you know, self-reflection and, you know, those critical I suppose questions, but also really answering it truthfully and honestly as well. And I know, for example, we're you know, going through some stuff at the moment down here where there's a bit of an issue around, you know, I suppose some of our clients around discharge information coming back to our AMS, and which obviously then has an impact on the continuum of care for some of our clients. So it's about working, you know, what are some of the barriers around getting discharge information back in a timely manner? What can we obviously look at doing from a health service perspective around that, and why is it important from a client's perspective as well? So that's one example. But I think you know, asking the questions first and foremost is a really important way of seeing what some of those problems are as a starting point, and having, I suppose, having a seat at the table as well, you know, at that senior leadership and senior management perspective, where we're not just coming in as consultants, it's coming in as, as people that do have these answers to some of these questions as well. And, looking at obviously creating those systems and policy changes as well at that senior level is fundamentally important that I see anyway.
And Jade, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? I mean, you clearly sit within a healthcare service delivery system, and I just wondered if there are days when it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And just aligning with what Brett was saying, the times when it's good, or either from my own experience or what I get to witness, is times where power is truly shared, because that sets the process up in a way that allows the positive things to happen that we've talked about already. The autonomy and decision making, the driving towards a vision that we have, the ability to just ensure that grounding of what we do is in the right place. And generally that means that the workflow is really easy for it to be appropriate and effective from there. So yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that part, that really early true power sharing is a real enabler. Because we talked about allies as individuals, but sometimes actually the most critical allies are the institutions within themselves and the way they can enable
and facilitate. Okay. Andrea, I have a different question for you, if I might. I guess I look at your bio, and there's a lot about you being a researcher as well as a teacher, and I just wonder if you can just tease out a bit how your teaching work informs your research work and what overlap there is, and where does one help the other, and just if you could bring those two things together and how they are wedded for you.
Sure, Leon. So I've been quite lucky in doing research in communication skills, learning from the great work being done in New Zealand with the Meihana model and the Hui process about infusing Aboriginal perspectives into how communication is done within, say, a clinical encounter. And that was been through discussions with other academics, through teaching with students, asking for, I guess you always get the question, what do we do? Tell us exactly. So wanting a few more targeted tips and frameworks, but also then learning from colleagues, and Lyme is such a great space to see innovations being done in other areas around how we can think about improving or better preparing our students to have those capabilities that we want. So I've been able through research to talk with healthcare practitioners, but importantly Aboriginal community members, about what is it that they want in a communication encounter, and then we can directly translate that into how we are teaching students, and similar things around power sharing, around institutional and personal trust, the importance of clinicians being able to share something of themselves, not just take from the patient, but early on give a little bit about who they are, comes through really importantly. And then when we go to our, I guess our curricula, we can not only say this is important, but we can provide quite a strong evidence-based within the academy that so highly relies on evidence-based practice, that what we're doing is effective and is also representative of broader Aboriginal community views as per our research, which isn't completely everybody, it's defined at the moment, but it is able to inform our teaching. So it's not just what I think needs to be done, there's a broader base there.
So actually it's a two-way thing between teaching and research and teaching.
Yeah.
Thank you. Candice, we have some questions in the Q&A. Would you like me to read one to the panel? Or are you happy to do it?
I'm happy to do it, unless you would like to also.
No, I'm sure you can.
Beautiful. So we have a couple of questions for our, I'm going to take the credit here for my wonderful panel. Okay, don't worry about what anybody else says. First of all, thank you for the fantastic insights and articulation of the challenges working in the space. but somebody in the audience would like to know whether you could give some specific examples of a time or a way an ally has promoted you and or your team and or your curriculum goals. And this time I might start with Jade.
Awesome. Again, it's kind of following along the theme about sharing of space and sharing of power, but one particular example for me would be in the processes of embedding curriculum across the whole domain. One of the things we've been working on is sitting alongside other departments and working out ways in which we can co-teach or co-design curriculums and assessments. And so we have a great ally locally in the head of Department of Pediatrics who was really able to enable that space holding, allow us to come in together and allow some freedom to really challenge and critique their curriculum as it was, or what they're teaching as it was, and work together to determine what were the key teaching points that would align with what we wanted, but also what they needed to cover, and to develop, we were able to develop a assessment which actually forms both the paediatric grade and the Hauora Māori grade shared. So again, going back to the recurring themes of space and power.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jade. Andrea?
Yes, I agree. We've had great leadership that have invested in Aboriginal employment and Aboriginal leadership, bringing more people together and like Jade said, creating that space for us to discuss and come up with priorities about what we think is important. And things like, instead of having to advocate for time in assessment and time in curriculum, it just kind of gets allocated quite easily. So that's some examples of where allies have been very helpful. Personally, I've been very well supported in terms of research and being given time to do my work, have a couple of weeks to just write, which is such a privilege when you're in an education space. So been very lucky, around resourcing, advocacy and being provided with some time and support to do the work that I'd like to do.
Beautiful. And Brett?
I think it's really important what Andrea was saying there is about senior leaders, or the senior leader exec or the team having, I suppose, providing that space and time from a resource perspective as well. I think that's the important part. I think I came into my role at UNSW where gone are the days of relying on the goodwill of our guest lecturers coming in to provide a session of here or here. Well, if we want this expertise, we have to pay for this expertise, which I think is really important. And I think it's been fantastic from my perspective, where we've been able to actually provide a monetary aspect to either guest lecturers or tutorials or expertise within this particular space is really fundamentally important. And I think I'm sort of at the stage now, obviously being 2 years into, I suppose, reviewing and embedding curriculum, where it's not so much myself now going out to academics within our different phases. It's academics coming to me now saying, hey, we've got this embedded in phase 1, which is year 1 and 2. How do we then go about looking at doing this, embedding it in years 3, 4, 5, and 6? An example is one of my colleagues, Greg Smith, who's a non-Indigenous guy from New Zealand, looking at our research project, and there was no Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing from a research perspective in their independent learning project, which is their 4th year. So we've been able to embed Aboriginal knowledges from a research perspective across their research year, but also then having an assessment linked to that as well. So that's coming from a non-Aboriginal colleague or ally who sees the importance of having Aboriginal research embedded and translated, and then we then obviously work and provide the structure and foundations of how to do that. But that's from an ally saying, hey, we've got this shortage. This is what I think needs to happen. Can you obviously help facilitate that? So it's not me now doing that hard sell in inverted commas of the importance of embedding our content and our knowledges into curriculum. So, that's one example. Another example is in phase 3 in years 5 and 6, where we've now got some discipline specific stuff around, for example, social and emotional wellbeing, which is linked to phase 3. And that's from another academic who's said, hey, this is missing. can you help obviously look at embedding this, because I don't know how to do it, but I know the importance of it as well. So it's more, you know, I suppose more my colleagues seeing the importance of it and now asking, hey, I need this support and help. Can you obviously facilitate that? Yeah, which is really important.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm really happy to report that I likewise have had very similar experiences, and we're receiving at Deakin a great deal of support from non-Indigenous colleagues, as Andrea and Brett have highlighted, especially from our leadership team. And I think that's what's really important, is that you have a leadership team who want to be able to encourage the involvement of and the growth of Indigenous health. I think without things do remain somewhat of a challenge. All right, panel. So this is, I believe, some of a comment, but also questions. So bear with me as I read this out. So Elizabeth has asked, first of all, she's wanting to thank Lime for bringing this amazing and inspiring panel together. It's also exciting to hear that medical schools are changing and that a new generation of graduates will be coming through the health system in the future. Elizabeth's concern is that hospitals are immune to this change at present and that they do enormous damage to junior medical officers and potentially undo the great work happening prior to graduation. Working within the medical college is a big part of the solution, but just wondering what we can do through education to address entrenched institutional racism in hospitals. Just an easy one as we segue into, you know, the latter half of the panel discussion. Thanks, Elizabeth. And this time we might get started with Andrea. Sorry, Andrea, first cab off the rank. So let me read that again, just to be clear. So Elizabeth is wondering that working within the medical colleges is a big part of the solution, but just wondered what can they be doing through education to address the entrenched institutional racism in hospitals?
So it's a huge question. So I'll kick off, but I'm not sure actually if I can answer it. But I guess hospitals are their own institution themselves. They have a culture, there is a governance, there's leadership, there's practices, particularly with, from experience as a junior medical officer, some of those things around clinical decision making, your support, how much time you have, your cognitive load. There's so many things that you could delve into around how we support junior doctors working in healthy environments with adequate cultural and clinical support so that they're able to make good clinical decisions and have people around them to help them through that process, whether that be really well-trained supervisors or a really well-resourced Aboriginal health liaison unit. But then change often comes from the top. What is the governance process within hospitals? Are there large Indigenous governance that are looking at processes, looking at accountability, and starting to change some of those policies and procedures and employment within the hospital? It's such a huge thing. I might just stop there and throw to the others and see what they think.
That's okay too. We might head over to Brett.
I agree with Andrea. It's such a massive question. I mean, like there's probably 4 or 5 questions within that, but how do we, I suppose, address entrenched institutional racism within hospitals? I think first and foremost, it's around those governance processes and the policies and procedures in place, but calling it out for what it is, I think is a really important aspect, first and foremost, and saying, hey, we know that our structures and our foundations are built on institutional racism as a starting point. I think is really, really important. But then starting to, I think we've been doing that for a number of decades now, saying, yes, we've identified that racism is a massive issue, and we've got that much research out there saying that racism doesn't make us sick. We know all these things. Racism stops us accessing health services. We know that. But where do we come to the point of drawing a line in the sand, saying, well, how are we going to change this? How are we going to be implementing effective changes moving forward. I mean, I don't think I have the answer for that, but I think calling it out, but then also identifying some of our shortfalls and some of our shortcomings, and whether that's from a governance perspective and some of our policies and processes, but also utilising the experience and expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as consumers of healthcare, but also at that senior management perspective of bringing in different worldviews and different understandings of how we see health, should be as a construct, and not just through that lens of a biomedical Westernised approach to healthcare as a starting point. Because I think too many times we've seen a lot of people obviously dying or becoming worse due to issues of racism as well. But I think calling it out as a starting point, but then showing that we are, I suppose, implementing effective change is that next step where I think we're lacking at times currently, is a really important part to be thinking about as well. But I don't have the answer at this stage, unfortunately.
And look, I don't think anybody's got a single answer. I think there's multiple answers, in fact, and all power to you, panel, because this is my most dreaded question to ever come across when I sit on these very same things. And I think, for what it's worth, I think the work that we are doing as academics and in clinical schools is another of those. It's another solution, not the solution, but the more that we train our junior doctors coming through, and equip them with the skills and the knowledge to be able to call it out, that's one step closer. And I've certainly had experiences with some of our clinical students who have gone on an Aboriginal health placement at a hospital, have gone on a placement at a hospital where there's been a large demographic of Aboriginal patients, and they've actually come to me, called me after the fact and said, "Candice, I believe you." So it was a bit of a light bulb moment for them. And then they followed with, "I don't know what to do." So I don't think any one person, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, has the answer, but I'll be quiet. And Jade, over to you.
Yeah, so huge, obviously. But I think, like all huge and uncomfortable questions, what's really important is just to be explicit and honest around it. And so I think that's one of the critical things, is that we teach our students that they will be going into a racialised healthcare system, and we teach them how to be critical thinkers within that space, how to be critical thinkers about their own clinical practice, and to be agents of change within that system. And so, we're very explicit around the fact that there's racism in the healthcare system. We're really explicit around the fact that there's a hidden curriculum. And if we don't acknowledge it and call it out, then we don't allow our students to build defences against it when they get out there, or other skills to unpick it and challenge it when they're in that space. I think the discussion around medical colleges is really critical, and I think we've really reached that time now where these wonderful medical students are becoming junior doctors, looking towards training, and are expecting a higher calibre of the colleges to build on the knowledge and the skills that they already have. And that, our teachers are becoming learners, and our learners are becoming teachers, as our students and our our specialist trainees are more knowledgeable in this space than some of their teachers. So I think it's really critical, and I'd love for the colleges to work it out, and want to go on that journey for themselves, but they're going to have to whether they want to or not, because their trainees, who pay them a lot of money, are going to make them have to lift their game. And so I think that is how we get individual agents of change making a system of change. But the last point too, as academics, that I think is really critical, is to acknowledge, especially as Indigenous academics, the power and privilege we take along as well, and the roles that we can play in actually being part of the system change. So some of you will be aware that we're in the process of changing our entire healthcare system here in Aotearoa and restructuring it with the aim to have a co-governed healthcare system. And part of that is ensuring that some of our brilliant Indigenous clinical academics are in that space leading what that might look like.
Oh, well, I hope to see you there, Jade.
Well, cautiously optimistic.
That's wonderful. I've got a question here from Michelle before we change direction and head over to the last question from Sharon. But Michelle's, first of all, acknowledged that this is a great panel and she's not wrong. How can we upskill our older supervisors around entrenched racism? And Brett, we'll start with you this time.
Oh God. I think that's the hard part. It's the entrenched. It's that lived journey of this is all they've known. You know, I think that's the hard part, and I think we need to be. And I like what Jade was saying too. We actually need to give our students that safe space to actually call out these older supervisors for their racist attitudes and behaviours and beliefs, and ensuring that there are no ramifications for our students, because there always will be ramifications where we've got this power imbalance as a starting point, where supervisors here, students are down here. Whether we like it or not, that's a reality that our students do face. We can have this, you know, co-design, co-leadership, co-training model from an institution perspective, but when they go out into their clinics to actually be obviously supervised, you're going to have these power imbalances as well. And I think at times I wouldn't say it's a lost cause, but you know, you've got some of these supervisors that have had a 40 to 50 years of this lived experience of this is the way they've seen the world, and this is the way, you know, medicine should be, and this is the way, you know, the life should be. So it's about, you know, as I said before, you know, calling them out, but also creating that safe space for our students to say, hey, this is not appropriate, this is not acceptable. But also, I think that there actually needs to be ramifications for some of these supervisors who continually to perpetuate these actions of obviously, you know, racisms within the healthcare system as well. Because I think too many times when something does happen or someone calls it out, the outcomes or the actions are definitely not justified, and it's a bit of a slap on the wrist. Okay, go and do this cultural awareness training, and that'll become, you know, therefore you'll become anti-racist as well, which we know is complete and utter nonsense. But I think, yeah, calling it out is a really important part. But I think at times it's waiting for our new generations to obviously come through into those leadership positions as well. As bad as that sounds, I don't think we are going to change some people's attitudes, beliefs, and biases around their racist attitudes, you know, over a short period of time, unfortunately.
Jade, thanks, Brett.
Yeah, I think we also need to decide how we privilege knowledge and teaching. So our teachers, including our supervisors, get paid a lot of money. They get good accolades for it. It is a position of privilege and power, and as such should come with accountability. So how do we as a system, or those that develop and monitor the system, measure that accountability and hold all of our teachers to that bar? Because actually, if we start appointing, retaining, and promoting clinical teachers based on their ability to not be racist, you'd find that they would start to be a little bit less racist, or at least explicitly, which from our students' point of view is what we need them to be doing. So yeah, I think again, the system has to decide what it thinks is important and reward accordingly.
I feel like we should just stop there. The system needs to decide. That's great. Andrea, any final comments before I move us on to our next question?
Yeah, just totally agree with what's already been said around accountability mechanisms, about it being okay to report and that not fearing any sort of backlash or other punishment for raising racism against a supervisor who is in a privileged and powerful position. So yeah, coming at it from one end of educating supervisors, but then being able to have a process where they're held accountable if there is an act that's deemed inappropriate, and how we address that.
Perfect. Thank you, panel. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to keep us moving. But Sharon has asked, do you know how you can factor the dollar amount of savings by embedding extra time into timeline in projects. Sharon, I don't know, Lillian, are we able to...
So time is money. I guess it's the essence of this, isn't it? And I guess, you know, I think this is a really interesting question because I think it is challenging to simply put in your grant application money set aside for time, or for your project application, money set aside for time to have conversations. Perhaps, Andrea, you might talk to that a little.
Sure, I think particularly around doing appropriate Aboriginal health research, it requires engagement within the community, requires significant relationship building with your local area and with wider key stakeholders. And that does take a lot of time, which often isn't acknowledged or recognised in a traditional research trajectory. So it might be cheaper and quicker to allocate a certain amount of time for a project, but you're actually you're not able to achieve your outcomes. You can't do effective quality Indigenous health research and get those diverse perspectives into the research findings that can be translated without that relationship building, which often isn't kind of formal. It's a lot of informal work that happens around the sides, and that does require resources and acknowledgement, which doesn't often happen.
Thanks, Andrea. Jade, Brett, do either of you have any other comments?
You know, pretty much just building on from what Andrea is saying, but just that acknowledging the actual cost saving that is ultimately in comparison to doing it fast and coming up with useless outcomes that don't actually have any benefit for our people. So actually putting in the cost into doing it right in the long term is actually a great investment of both time and money.
Thanks, Jade. Brett?
And I think part of that too, I mean, we look at a lot of funding bodies from a research perspective. It's okay, we've got this great idea, let's put in the funding application. If we're successful, then we go out and do that. It's almost back to front where we need to be, communities say we've got this need, this is an issue, this is a problem. Okay, this is what we think some of the solutions are, and then we obviously look at trying to get, as part of our funding process is that community consultation engagement is absolutely imperative with the key aspects around that. How do we then do that from a dollars perspective? I'm not quite sure, but I think we need to identify that some of the current research funding bodies structures are a little bit back to front from our perspective, where we know community engagement and consultation will actually make or break a project from a research perspective. And if we don't allow that or factor that in, that's a challenging aspect. And time is, I suppose, so different from project to project, community to community. Depends on the relationships you have with certain communities from a research perspective as well, depending on some of the historical legacies that have been left over around research, but even around building educational resources as well, or engaging with local communities if we're doing an on-country experience as part of their curriculum design as well. It's about being aware of that and I suppose identifying that and making sure that we can come up with a plan that can factor in this extra time. I think is really important. But I think what Sharon said is identifying it as a starting point is really important. But it's going to be different from institution to institution, from government to non-government organisations as well. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It's going to be quite individualised from community to community and organisation to organisation.
Perfect panel I've got, I tell you. And I just wanted to share Sharon's, I think, comment here. So, yep, it's been challenging working for government when we know how important to embed time into your timeline requires the relationship responsibilities to occur. I'm going to pause the research questions if there are any more, just because we will head into that very shortly. And there's one final comment before we do move on. From Anonymous saying, calling out racism is a great starting point, but to move towards systems of change, is that a matter of having our mob in key leadership positions in decision making? I feel like that's we're rolling with a nod of approval. Wonderful. I like it. Great. Okay, so just to allow an opportunity for my panel members to take a sip of water and a quick breath, just another Lime plug. So don't forget that if you're on the social media, hashtag Lime Staying Connected. A reminder that we have the Dennis McDermott Memorial Award for Excellence in Cultural Safety. The applications are now open and can be accessed from our Lime Connection websites. And thank you everybody for all the new questions, all the questions that keep coming through. Lilon, I believe you have an extra question for our panel.
Look, I have a few. I wanted to ask you, Jade, you mentioned the time that gets used up by arguing the case, particularly around the recent turmoil, and dealing with the racism implicit in all of this and how that saps energy. But I'm just wondering too if it has a place in inspiring and informing your teaching, and how it might also change your approach or influence your approach in your teaching and how you talk to, particularly to medical students.
Yeah, that's a great question, Leon. So if we use the letter from the professors again, the far more articulate than I, Dr. Tina Ngata wrote a great response to it, which actually thanked them for their letter, for giving us tools for teaching to show how colonisation in the institution and colonisation of science is an active, continuing process, not a historical one that we need to unpick and think about in the past, but continues to happen every day for us as Indigenous academics in this space. And I think, yeah, I said at the time on Twitter that took me from my angry space to actually, that's so right. Here is a tool that we now have to use to show A, what bad behaviour looks like, but B, to get us to actually critically think about how are we actively colonising our spaces at the moment, or more importantly, how are we actively decolonising our spaces right now.
I feel like that's a mic drop moment right there, if I can say so myself. But Lilon,
by Tina Ngata.
That was a wonderful response to it. Thank you.
And can I ask another question, Candice?
Absolutely, you can, Lilon. You've got one more question.
I've got one more. Okay. Well, I guess actually my question is to you, Andrea, because I guess, and it sort of circles around and takes in a lot of what we've talked around already, which is about working with communities and engaging and taking the time with communities. But I guess I'd just like to tease out a bit more about how you balance the work of having a teaching position and the work that involves, and finding the time to spend with communities, and how you balance those things up.
Yeah, thanks, Lilon. Probably not very well. I think it's sort of an ongoing learning thing for me as I go through my PhD, and I've got a Indigenous governance group who I rely on, as well as my supervisors, to kind of guide me as to how I'm going. I found early on that when I was teaching, that actually was a kind of a nice way to do a bit of community engagement for my research, because we were running communication skills sessions with community members. We were able to sort of talk to them around what our research was looking to do, and form some connections that was sort of two birds, one stone, connections for teaching and community engagement in the curriculum, but also being able to form some long-term partnerships for research. I think I've fluctuated with different teaching loads, and I guess it's an ongoing tension around the wider institution as well, how many people are available to step in and to come and assist teaching if you do need to take a higher research load. who else is around to support it? Does the leadership recognise that if you are doing research that there does need to be added, I guess, support in terms of curriculum implementation? So it's a bit of a balance, and it's your work and your own management of your time, but also what supports are provided around you, which does fluctuate, I've found over time. Is that?
You know, I think part of that too, I think it's okay to say no. And you know, like, I suppose someone that's just graduated from a PhD, the amount of people now approaching you to be involved with a research project because you've got that piece of paper is ridiculous. But it's okay to say no and say, hey, like, well, I don't have the capacity for that at this particular stage because I've got whatever else is going on as well. But then part of you, by saying no, is like, well, who else is going to do it? And can they also do, I suppose, you know, do whatever it is in a way that's culturally safe as well, which is really important. And then, yeah, part of it is also, you know, protecting your community that you live and work in. By saying no, that's not appropriate at this particular time. But it does take a lot of effort to say no. You know, because if you don't say no, it's about then overburdening our community members as well, which is really important to be thinking about. But it's hard to say no, Leilon.
Yes, you have to practice.
Perfect. I believe somebody may be leaving the panel discussion, but wants to thank you for the amazing knowledge sharing opportunities. Wonderful. Any other questions, Leilon?
If I get to ask one more, then I just have a final one. And I guess it is really looking at each of you, including you, Candice. You all wear multiple hats and you all have multiple roles. And I guess what I wanted to ask you was, how do you rise above being reactive, and how do you keep a sense of direction to your ongoing work? How do you determine your priorities and weigh up all of those bits of demands from all your different roles? Sorry, it's a
loaded question. I'm happy just to quickly acknowledge and then hand over to the panel, but this is how I do that. I have fantastic colleagues and friends that help me to be able to manage a lot of my competing priorities and demands. I work with a wonderful group of colleagues at Deakin, but Lyme has probably been for me personally, been something that's grounded me for a long time, if I'm being honest. It's a network of people that I can go to where I don't need to start a conversation again, and that I can go to for whatever support, be it because I need a question answered, be it because I just need to go, whatever the case is. But it's not about me, it's about the wonderful panel members here, so I'll hand it back over to them.
I think from my perspective, Leilon, it's about picking your battles. I think most days we could forever be reactive and reply or respond aggressively. It's like, seriously, we're going to answer that question again, like as a bit of an anecdote. But I think at times picking your battles, because if you're forever always being reactive, you get labelled as an angry black person, which is okay. At times I don't mind that. But then that doesn't do anything for your health and well-being as well, because if you're constantly on the front foot, being aggressive, and you actually become unwell, and then you burn out, and then that good work you're trying to implement and achieve falls by the wayside at times. So I think picking your battles is really important. I agree with Candice, having a really good supportive network is fundamental, as I don't think we have a critical mass of Aboriginal educators across in any institution from that perspective. We might have a few here and a few there. So making sure that we obviously have that networking system is really important. But then also just, going back to community and being involved and engaged with community as that sense of being grounded and knowing we're doing it for that greater good of trying to improve the health and well-being of our people, I think, is a starting point. But yeah, I think picking my battles is a really important perspective, because I know one of my colleagues and mentors, she burnt out because she was forever not picking a battle. She was always trying to have a conversation with everybody, and got the better of her, and she had to obviously finish up, which is a massive problem within an institution as well around that. So yeah, I think picking your battles, it's easier said than done. But yeah, I don't think we can fight everything, and stay off social media at times as well is really important.
I'm just going to be very explicit and say I do it very poorly, to be very honest, but try to. It's very easy to be reactive, and then sometimes it feels like that's all you're doing is being reactive. But equally, I don't want to let opportunities to educate pass by. So if there's the need to be reactive, I will. For me, it goes back to probably one of the very earliest things we said is about being kaupapa driven, or driven by the why. And so I've kind of got to an algorithm now, whereas can I see a way in which this piece of work will directly improve the health and well-being of Māori people? And if I don't, then it's not worth my time. So time is far too precious, and good luck on your work, but that's not for me. Unfortunately, there's lots to be done in that space, so that still ends up with multiple hats doing multiple things, but at least it allows a space to keep away from what's token, which I think is actually probably the most damaging sucker of time.
Agree with Brett and Jade. I'd probably add, for me, it's having really good support network, as Candice mentioned, being able to talk to people in positions that have wisdom and knowledge in this space, and being able to kind of get your guidance and your path after something happens to get you on the right track, as Jade said, to ensure that you're on something that's going to be of use and is worth time, and to be able to have that discussion so that reactivity passes and you can make a good decision. That's often guided, I find, by seniors.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to say something on that point too, which was around, so in Pride Out, the Pacific Rim Indigenous Doctors Congress staff, we often talked about a space in which you actually get to shed the cloak of racism, and you forget how heavy it is to carry it around all the time, but to get into spaces like this where you can let that drop and actually fill the cup again, and check your direction and check with other colleagues is a really, really healing space.
Well, just wonderful responses all round, if you ask me. So we've got about 8 minutes left, and I was going to open up my long list of questions that I had in the case that we didn't have any questions, but here we are with 8 minutes to go, and more questions than necessary. So I thought, rather than asking any more, what I might do is just allow for any closing comments about Indigenous health education, just briefly from each of our panellists before I start to wrap things up and redirect people to our networking rooms. So I might, Brett, might start with you, just because I can see you deep in thought, so I'm going to interrupt it and go for it now.
I've been thinking about this question for a little bit, Candice, and I think from Indigenous health education perspective, it's everybody's business. Like, I think that's it. It's not just us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but also Māori colleagues. It's not just our business, it's everybody's business. And I think if we can be aware of that, I think it's really important. And it's like, student success, it's from the cleaner to the academic to the to our bus drivers. It's everybody's business to actually make our students succeed as well. I think from a health education perspective, it's everybody's business. And if it's simple as that, to be honest. I don't think it doesn't have to be laid in all these layers of controversy or challenges. But if we think about Indigenous health education, it's everybody's business, because we know that our ways of knowing, being, and doing has kept us on this earth for thousands and thousands and thousands of years in a way that's improved our health and well-being. So if we can look at ensuring that it's everybody's business, I think it's a good way of progressing, but also not forgetting where we're meant to be going and where we've come from as well.
That's perfect. Thanks, Brett. Andrea.
Candice, yeah, I was looking at one of your questions around knowledge translation, and one of my colleagues, we've been talking a lot about praxis and about reflection in action, and that how what we learn and how we view the world and our understandings, it's not just something quiet, but it informs how we act, our actions, how we conduct ourselves and our relationship building, what our political advocacy is, our social connections. So it's about how we take what we learn and put that into action, and how we encourage that with our students as well. It's not just something quiet in class or on a lecture, but it's how they conduct themselves in a variety of situations. So that's something I've been thinking about a lot.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrea. And Jade.
Oh, I don't know that I have anything profound to wrap us up, other than, like many times talking with you wonderful colleagues, I've learnt far more than I've shared with the team. It's so wonderful to listen to both our similarities, but also the differences in our spaces and the journeys that we're on. Again, reflecting back on the fact that, you know, we are peoples who know our ways to navigate and know the direction we want to be going in. And as long as we're sort of set on that point, then collectively we're heading in the right direction. We talk a lot, and you mentioned it before, around scaffolding within our degrees. But I'm really excited to think about what the future holds for scaffolding of Indigenous health over time as we move forward into a more, you know, increasing the criticality of the thinking and the education that we're doing. And so, again, said before about the future being bright with our medical students coming through, but I think the future's bright for Indigenous health educators too, in the space that we're occupying. So yeah, nei ranga mihi kia koutou for being able to share some space and time and power with you all today.
Wonderful. And I'm sure you can hear all the applauding in your virtual backgrounds. But thank you again to each of you. It's been incredible to likewise share this time, this space and this knowledge with you. And I'm confident by both the comments and otherwise that everybody that's joined us today has walked away with having learned something new. So thank you again. Before we wrap up, I've got a few things that I'd like to share with everybody just briefly. So we've got a Lime survey. So we really do encourage you, please, to set aside some time for completing. Your feedback is really, really valuable. Shane is on standby to help with any information if you need. He's also just posted in the chat box the link to the survey. And please, it'll take a couple of minutes, and we'd really value, if now you could do it just quickly, that would be ace. And while you're doing that, it gives me a perfect opportunity just to thank our support organisations, our sponsors, Medical Deans Australia and New Zealand, the Māori Medical Practitioners Association, our sponsors, the Australasian College for Emergency Medicine, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Ophthalmologists, the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, the Australia and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, Deakin University's Medical School, and the University of New South Wales Medical Schools. Without our sponsors, it would be particularly difficult to run such fabulous programs like this one. That if you wish to connect with other conference delegates, you'll find their contact email. Sorry, bear with me just for a wee moment. You'll find their contact email addresses via the limeconnection.net.au page. And just a reminder again, one final plug, that Lime Network is on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and the official conference hashtag is #LimeStayingConnected. You'll now move into a random breakout room. It's an opportunity for those that are interested to chat, to catch up, to link up, to debrief, There is absolutely no obligation for anybody to join. The Lyme experience is that you'll often see someone you don't know or that you know of and have wanted to talk to for a little while, or that you haven't seen in a little while. The rooms will be open for the next 30 minutes. There's a link now to the breakout room in the chat. So now is the opportunity to move